Hi, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I am going to teach you how to crochet the Granny Hexi Stocking. This Christmas stocking is assembled by first crocheting hexagons, granny hexagons, and then sewing them together and adding a border at the end. This stocking is gently felted once you're completed, so this just makes it a little bit more durable and has a little bit of structure so that when you hang it up on your mantle, it doesn't lose its shape and it maintains that Christmas stocking design. So you can see I have a sample here in red and then a sample in green. I'm going to walk you step by step through making the green version here today in this tutorial. This crochet pattern is available on my website, originallylovely.com, and you can shop the yarn there as well. If you want to make both the green and the red version, you will need one ball of the colors Tabby, Cloud, Merlot, and Olive, and two balls of the color Natural. If you want to make just one stocking, you can use one ball of each color of yarn and you'll have some left over. You will also need a 5.5 millimeter crochet hook, a tapestry needle, and stitch markers, removable stitch markers to help you assemble the yarn. It really is best to use Originally Lovely Lana or a non-superwash wool for this stocking because that allows us to just gently felt the stocking so that it can hold its shape. If you don't use a wool yarn like Originally Lovely Lana, your stocking will lose its shape and won't quite have the same appearance and the same structure hanging up over the years. So as you can see here, we are going to be crocheting half hexes and full-size hexes. We will need to crochet 14 full-size hexagons and 3 half hexagons. And then once we have all those completed, we will sew those together, seam them together, and assemble the stocking. So I will walk you through step by step how to crochet a full hexagon and a half hexagon in this tutorial. First, we will start with a full hexagon. As you can see here, I have the pattern instructions written out as well as a crochet chart. If you don't know how to follow crochet charts, that's okay, but some people do find them helpful. To begin, you will start with a magic ring. This is basically just a loop that we're crocheting into at the beginning. I have a slower tutorial for the magic ring linked here if you would like to check that out. Once you have your magic ring, we will just chain one, and then you'll actually begin working into the ring itself. That's the best part. And then you just tighten it up with the tail when you are completed. So as you can see right there, we're going to be crocheting into that center. So we'll first work a puff stitch. So yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull up another loop, and yarn over, pull up a loop a third time. Now you will have 7 strands of yarn on your hook. So the 6 yarn over, pull up a loop strands, and then 1 that was already on your hook to begin with. Yarn over, pull through all 7 of those strands and chain 1. That's your first puff stitch. So now, just as we did before, we will work another puff stitch into this magic ring. Yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull up another loop, yarn over, pull up a loop a third time. Yarn over, pull through all 7 loops on your hook, and then chain 1. You will repeat this across the round until you have 6 puff stitches total. This will just create the first round of crochet in the very center of our hexagon. So once you're getting a little bit further along, you can tighten up that magic ring. You just pull the strand, just like so, and complete that final puff stitch. Chain 1, and now you can see here we have our first round completed. Tighten up that magic ring, and we will slip stitch to join with our new color. So the first thing, we need to find that stitch, not the chain 1. We're actually slip stitching into that first stitch itself. It's always a little bit tight, but try to just get through 2 of those strands, 2 of those 3 strands, and then we will move on to our second color, which is Natural. So slip stitch with the new color, just like so. And then you can kind of tighten up those strands and hold them back out of the way. Chain 3 and turn your work. Unless otherwise noted in this pattern, the turning chain will count as the first stitch. So this is essentially our first double crochet stitch. Now we will be working into the gap spaces between the puff stitch. So it's like that chain 1 stitch created kind of a gap space between the stitches. That's where we're going to be working into. And we're going to work 4 double crochet stitches into this puff stitch gap space. So 5 double crochet stitches total. Our turning chain counts as 1, so we have to work 4 more in this space. As you can see here, we have a little cluster and they're all in that same gap space. So now we skip 1 stitch, and then into that next gap space, that next chain space, we're going to work 5 more double crochet stitches. And then we're going to repeat this across in each of the gap chain spaces around the row. I do want to point out the reason that we are turning at the end of each round is because this will just prevent our hexagon from twisting, and it will keep it really nice and flat and uniform, because otherwise it will kind of have like a spiraled appearance. Not everyone turns their hexagons at the end of each row, and there's a ton of different ways to crochet your hexagons, but this is what I find works best. Coming up to the end here, we're going to work our final 5 double crochet stitches into that gap space, and now we will have to slip stitch to join with our new color once more. You can really tighten up the center of that magic ring now if you want, and just fully seal it closed. So insert your hook into that 3rd chain of the turning chain 3, which is the top of that first stitch, and slip stitch with your next color. Keep all of the strands a little bit tight, keep them from getting too loose, and then we will chain 3 again and turn once more. So now if you look directly under where we worked, there's kind of a gap between the double crochet clusters, and we're going to work 2 double crochet stitches here. So 3 total, because our turning chain is the first double crochet stitch. And just tighten up those stitches like so. So now skip 2 double crochets, and we're going to single crochet into that center double crochet of the 5 double crochet cluster. You can see it right there. Just insert your hook and single crochet into that center double crochet. Skip 2 and you have the gap space again between your double crochet clusters from the previous row. So now here in this space, we will work 3 double crochet stitches, a chain 1, and then 3 more double crochet stitches. That chain 1 space in the corner will be what shapes the corner space and gives the hexagon that 6-pointed look that is so specific about a hexagon. Up until now, it's kind of looked like a circle, but this will really start making it look like a true hexagon. So finishing up those 3 double crochet stitches, we will skip 2 again. You can see here first our corner starting to form, and then skip 2 again, and into that 3rd double crochet we will work a single crochet. Skip 2, and then we're back to that gap space. So now we will once more work 3 double crochet stitches, chain 1, and 3 more double crochet stitches. We'll repeat this all the way around the hexagon for round 3, and then we will work our final round 4 here. So you can see we have another corner formed. Work that single crochet in the center double crochet stitch and repeat all the way around. Once you get to the end, you will work 3 more double crochet stitches into that final space, so the same space that we started working into, because we just need to finish up this corner. So 3 double crochet stitches there, chain 1, and now we will slip stitch to join in our new color. So you can see we are ending at the corner right here. So just insert your hook into that 3rd chain of the turning chain, so the top of that stitch. And with your 4th and final color, color D, you will work a slip stitch to join. This just makes kind of a more seamless color change if you work these slip stitches with the new color of yarn. This is kind of a little tip that you can use in many projects. So chain 3 and turn, and now we are at our final round. And this round's actually the easiest because it's just double crochet clusters around. So right below that chain 3, there is a gap space, and we will work 2 more double crochet stitches to complete that first double crochet cluster. You can tighten up those stitches a bit, and then skip the next 3 stitches, and into that single crochet stitch, you will work another double crochet cluster. So 3 double crochet stitches into that single crochet stitch right there to create our next granny cluster. So 3 double crochet stitches right there. The design for this hexagon was actually inspired from a poinsettia flower. We thought that that looked really festive and just added a nice little holiday look to these granny hexagons. So after you work that double crochet cluster in the single crochet, you're back to a corner. So 3 double crochet stitches, chain 1, and 3 double crochet stitches, all in that chain 1 corner space. We're just working a chain 1 at the corners to keep it nice and tight, and from having too big of holes in the stocking, it just kind of makes it a little bit more dense and a little bit more solid, so that there's fewer holes than would be otherwise. So now we're back to that double crochet, or that single crochet space, working 3 double crochets in there, and we're repeating all the way around to that final space. We have to work 1 more double crochet cluster into that starting corner. So 3 double crochets into the same gap space that we started with. And then we will chain 1 and slip stitch to join our final slip stitch. We're just working it in this color because this is our final round of the hexagon. So just try to get into 2 of those 3 strands of the chain, just the V stitches of the chain, not the bar behind the chain. It can be a little bit tight generally. Slip stitches are always a little tighter than regular stitches, but just try and get in like that, and then you can snip your strands and weave in your ends. I like to leave this final strand here as a little bit of a tail because I'll use that tail actually to seam a lot of the hexagons together, but the other strands themselves you can weave in now. So another benefit actually of working with a non-superwash wool like Originally Lovely Lana for the stocking is that you don't have to weave in your ends that thoroughly. You can just weave them in one direction for a couple inches, just through a few stitches like I'm doing here. And normally I would go back, forth, to kind of really secure it in. And that's a lot with a multicolored hexagon like this, a lot of ends. But as you can see, we can just go one direction. And because we're felting it, it's actually going to hold that end in place on its own. The yarn will hold it in because it will like tangle it together. So you can see here, I've weaved in all my ends. I left that final end because I'm going to use that to seam the hexagons together. And again, you will need to work 14 of the full hexagons. Moving on to the half hexagon, you can see I have the written instructions here and the crochet chart. Again, you don't need to know how to work crochet charts, but it can be helpful to reference, and it is there if you prefer to work from those. So beginning with a magic ring again, I will link that tutorial here as well for you if you want a slower tutorial for your magic ring. Begin with a chain 2 this time. So for the full hexagon, we started with a chain 1. Now we start with a chain 2, and then work our first puff stitch. So yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull up a loop, third time, and then pull through all 7 of those strands. Chain 1 and work another puff stitch. And then repeat that. So 3 times across, 3 puff stitch, chain 1, around into your magic ring. You can pull that ring closed. And then with our second color, color B, we're going to chain 3 and turn. So this is a little bit different because we're still working back and forth in, we're turning at the end of each round. There are rows here, but it's a little bit different. There's some differences here. So that first stitch right there, we're going to work 2 more double crochet stitches. So right there, just work 2 double crochet stitches to create kind of the first half of that cluster. And then into that gap space between the 2 puff stitches, we will work as normal. So our normal round 2, 5 double crochet stitches into that gap space. And then you will repeat this in the next gap space, 5 more double crochet stitches. And then the very last stitch, so it's actually a chain space, that turning chain, chain 2 that we started with, you will work 3 more double crochet stitches. So working around our second cluster of 5. So right there, you can see that turning chain is where we work our final 3 double crochet stitches. So that's just like half of a hexagon, and it gives a nice look. On the final double crochet stitch, don't pull that final loop through. We're going to pull that final loop through with our new color, just for kind of like a seamless color join. And then we just chain 1 this time and turn. Into that first stitch, so the white stitch right there, you will work a single crochet. And then again, we skip those 2 stitches. So this is like our regular round 3. And then in that gap space, we create a corner. So 3 double crochet stitches, chain 1, 3 double crochet stitches, all in that gap space between the 5 double crochet cluster, just to create that first corner. It always looks a little bit weird with a half hexagon until you get further, and almost until you complete the process, it looks a little bit off. So skip those first 2 double crochets, single crochet into that third double crochet, skip 2 more, and then work another corner. So 3 double crochet, chain 1, 3 double crochet. Coming up to that final space, we're going to skip 2, and then into that third chain right there, we're going to work a single crochet. But again, we're going to pull through those final 2 loops with our new color. So complete the single crochet with our color D to complete this round. Now we will chain 3 and turn, just like so. And we're going to work a double crochet into that final single crochet space, just 1 double crochet there. And now we're going to skip those 3 double crochets to that corner space, and we work a regular corner. So 3 double crochet stitches, chain 1, 3 double crochet, all in that chain 1 corner space. And then we're skipping those 3 double crochets and 3 double crochets into that single crochet space, just like so. So repeat this all the way around the hexagon to complete your final round. Coming up to the very end, you can see we have that final single crochet space. we're just going to work 2 double crochets into this final single crochet, and then cut our yarn and pull through to secure. Once again, you can leave this final strand to seam your hexagons together, but the other strands, I like to leave them in now just to kind of get it out of the way, make it a little bit cleaner when you actually go to assemble the stocking. So a few notes on actually assembling your stocking. It is kind of tricky, but basically you have to do it in each step, and you can come back and refer to this stocking assembly diagram if you need, but I'll basically walk you through each step now. So what you're going to first do is assemble it laying flat, just as you saw in the diagram. It's all the hexagons flat, and they look a little bit weird, but this is how you sew them together, and then you fold it a certain way, and we'll pin them to hold it in place and kind of see, because it gets pretty confusing quite quickly. So following that diagram, I'm going to attach this hexagon with those two there. And like I said before, I'm using the tail to seam them together, and this just kind of gives a one less tail to weave in, honestly. So if you look here, you can see each of the stitches. We're working into the back loop only of the stitches as we assemble them together. This just gives that kind of like ridged area. So starting with the corner, the chain 1 corner space, we're going to insert our needle into the back loop only of the one we're attaching it to. And now we have to find that chain 1 corner space of our next hexagon, which is actually behind the tail. That doesn't matter, but you want to make sure that you line up those chain 1 corner spaces together. So now back loop only of the first double crochet stitch, and back loop only of the first double crochet stitch on the next one. It's kind of underneath that final slip stitch join, and that doesn't matter. Just make sure you're matching up the first stitch with the first stitch. So now the center double crochet stitch of that chain 3 cluster through the back loop only, and then the center double crochet stitch of that chain 3 cluster on the other one. Just make sure you're lining them up 1 to 1, because otherwise it'll be confusing and a little bit messy when you get to it. So now the third double crochet, seaming those together. I just go back to front each time. I know a lot of people do whip stitch they just seam them together like a loop. I think that this way just looks a little bit more uniform. It's kind of like a whip stitch variation, but I really like the way this looks. So coming up to our final double crochet stitch of that final cluster, and now to tighten this up, I just pull it tight and then I loosen it, pull it back out. Just make sure that the tension is even across that seam. Make sure you do stretch it outward so that it doesn't cause any puckering though in your work. Some people really like to seam their edges tight, and this will not look good. So if you tighten it up, just make sure you loosen it. So now we have to go into that corner space, and this corner space was actually already worked on the other join, but we go into it again. So just know it might be a little bit trickier to find, but it's just that chain 1 corner space, and it's basically the chain that's next to that final double crochet stitch that we just worked into. Working into this chain is easier. And then now we have to work into the corner chain again on that other, because we're working a different corner now. So on that opposite side, you want to work into that chain 1 corner space. So count over if you need to, count from the 3 double crochets and make sure you get in that corner. And now we have to match it up to the corner on our square. So right there as well, once more into that chain 1 corner space. So each corner gets worked into twice. This is okay. It looks really nice and uniform. There's not a hole or any spacing there. So I definitely recommend doing it this way. And then continue across just as we did on the last seam, working the back loop only of those stitches across and lining them up, each double crochet with its corresponding double crochet of the hexagon that's next to it. So working all the way down into, we have to seam into that final chain 1 corner space, and I tighten up the seam as well. Just be careful not to over tighten that seam that we already worked. And then again, make sure you loosen it up, stretch it out, make sure there's plenty of give there so that it's not too tight and doesn't cause any puckering in your work. So now that I've completed that seam, I just leave that tail sitting there, and you can kind of plan out the next place that your next hexagon will go and kind of arrange them and move the tail as you want. You might not be able to use all the tails. You might have to add in a strand of yarn here or there, but all in all, this is kind of a nice way. You have to weave in the tails anyways, so you might as well use them for the seams. So as you can see, if I were to put this hexagon there, I could go one way with that tail and up with the next tail. You can just kind of situate these, but essentially make sure you're following that diagram and just assembling them all flat as the diagram notes. This is really important because your stocking, when you fully assemble it and fold it to get that finished stocking shape, it won't work if you don't have them all seamed together the correct way. So at the very top of the stocking, you'll see that you have actually your half hexagons as well. Just attach those the same way that you've done the rest of the stocking along the top of the guide in the diagram. So as you can see here, I have them all completed, all of them seamed together, including the top ones. And now we can kind of fold it, and I'll show you what it will look like as you start to assemble the stocking. Again, this is where your removable stitch markers will really come in handy because it gets pretty confusing very quickly if you're only working parts of it, and it might be really hard to visualize where your next seam is. So fold along those dark lines that are in the diagram to kind of shape your stocking. So fold it under those top 2 lines, and then along the foot you want to fold those over as well, just to get that foot shape. And then that final angled piece that goes under, and it will start to make a little bit more sense why it looks the way it does once you get it all folded correctly. So once it's folded, you can see you kind of have that stocking shape, and then the toe. The toe is assembled a little bit different, so just ignore that for now, just leave that piece. But you can see kind of what the leg and the foot of the stocking looks like, and if you turn it over, you can see how those seams come together. All the tails are kind of in the way because I'll use these to sew the stocking together, sew those seams, but you can see here how it matches up. So that half comes over and meets there, and you can kind of get a little bit better understanding of where your seams will go along down the stocking, across the foot, and then finally the toe at the very end. So taking our removable stitch markers, like I said, these are really important. We're going to go down the diagram and we're going to match up based on which seams we match up together. You really want to do this and make sure you get all your seams properly aligned before you start, because like I said, it gets pretty confusing otherwise, and it's way easier to just do it right the first time than have to redo it. So these removable stitch markers are basically like safety pins. You just can pin the seam together, and then once you're sewing it closed, you can actually just take them out. So this seam matches up here, and we're just going to pin that together to hold it in place so that we know it lines up. And then moving on to seam number 2, we're just going to follow down the row, down the edge of the leg. So we'll have to flip it over, and then you can see there's seam number 2. Each of those pieces, those edges will match up together. So I'm just going to pin those together as well, hold it into place. And then you'll go down the seam each way, matching up like seam number 1, seam number 2, seam number 3, all the way down to the toe. Start at the top of the stocking at number 1 and then work your way down all the way to the toe. So now lining up just seam number 3, it's pretty obvious this way, and the leg is the easiest because the next seam is pretty obvious, but trust me, when you get to the foot, it will be a little bit more confusing. I had to assemble these quite a few times to figure it out just the way I wanted it and try and make the diagram in a way that makes sense. It was pretty tricky to get it to line up perfectly, but if you pin them together and work it slowly, I really think that it will not be too difficult and you'll have an okay time. Just line up each seam with the diagram, and then as you work, you can just take out these pins. So I am going to jump ahead a little bit here to the end of the leg. You can see that I have most of it completed, and now I just have to go across the foot. So if you turn it over, you can see the pinned seams, and now I have to work those back seams as well. So they might be a little bit more confusing, but again, if you're following it in order, it should make sense. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here as well and show you along down the edge of the foot and then the toe, because the toe is a little bit more confusing. So jumping a bit ahead here, I'm just completing all those seams for the foot, and you can really see how it's starting to form. You can see the shape of the stocking, and it looks a little bit less messy at this point. So I have the leg, the foot, the ankle, and now we just have those 3 more seams for the toe. So the confusing part about this one is that you actually have to fold it a bit. It's not quite as obviously lined up as the other ones, so this is extra important to pin these in place. This bottom seam here is easy enough. It's just actually folded up, so along the edge of the foot and then the toe, that first seam, pin in place. And then the next 2 are a little bit more confusing. Whereas up until this point, it's just been the obvious seam. The toe we actually have to fold up. So pinch that part where it goes in there. You can see there's like a little peak. Pinch those 2 together. So those are the 2 pieces that will actually form the toe, and pin that into place. And then after you have that pinned into place, you'll have to do that for the back as well. So that's the very final seam then. Once you have this part of the toe joined, you can look at the back, and then there's those final 2 pieces, and those come together as well. So it almost makes it look like the toe is coming together at a point, but that's not really necessarily the case, because it flattens out and it makes a curved shape once you have it completed. And then that's also another benefit of blocking and felting the stocking slightly, is it's basically like an aggressive block that will really hold that toe into place. So you can see it kind of comes together a little weird right there, but when it's all seamed together and flattened out, it will make sense. As you can see here on the red stocking, it just has that curve and that nice finished look. It looks beautiful. So follow that toe part very carefully and just don't get thrown off, and it will all come together beautifully. So once you have those seams all pinned into place, you will just sew down the edge as we did with all the other seams up until this point. So we have our tails that we haven't fully weaved in yet, and we can just sew with those as we've done with the flat diagram, and just start your seam. Once you get to a stitch marker, you can take that out because it's kind of being held in place by your seam at that point. And then continue all the way down the leg of the stocking, starting with seam number 1, going to seam number 2, so on all the way down to the toe to shape your stocking and complete the majority of the assembly. So you can see here we have it all the way completed down to the toe. You can see when you pull out that toe, it kind of has that point, but you can flatten it out and smooth it out nicely. That's one of the benefits of crochet. It has really nice stretch and movement. So kind of round out that toe how you like it. We will do that more when we block it, of course. but you can see here we have the whole foot of the stocking finished, and now we just have to finish up with the top border and the hanging loop. So these are the written instructions for the top border. Basically what you're going to do is in that stocking assembly diagram, there's a little star on the outer edge of the leg, and you're going to begin working into the magic ring of where that star is with your color you're using for the border. I used natural for both the green version and the red version, kind of to make them match. You can use whichever color you want, but I think that the white natural color looks really nice. So into that magic ring, pull up a loop, and then chain 1. So we're going to be working slip stitches around the opening of the stocking here, just to kind of set up the row that we'll be working into, or the round. So into each puff stitch, we will work 2 slip stitches, and then into each single crochet row, into each puff stitch and double crochet, we will be working 2 slip stitches, and then into the side of each single crochet, we will be working 1 stitch. So this is 45 stitches total around the opening of your stocking. If you're having a hard time getting exactly 45, you could kind of just go with more or less. If it's just a couple stitches, it really won't matter, but 45 should be the exact number that you end up with. So just work those slip stitches all the way around. Make sure not to work your slip stitches too tight. A lot of crocheters work slip stitches very tight or wonder why they have puckering, and it's because slip stitches actually have a lot less stretch than a full stitch, so like a single crochet or a double crochet. So just make sure you keep those slip stitches nice and loose as you work across your stocking. So jumping ahead just a little bit here, we're going to slip stitch into that first slip with that first slip stitch to join, and then we're not going to turn. We're going to turn after this first row, but for this next row we're going to keep it straight. So chain 1, slip stitch, and then chain 1, and now we're going to single crochet back loop only in each of these slip stitches around. That chain 1 does not count as our first stitch, so make sure you work into that first stitch and then just single crochet back loop only across all those slip stitches that you just worked. This gives a nice like defined border edge to that row, to the border. That front loop that we are leaving of the slip stitch kind of has just a defined line, which keeps it looking really nice and uniform. So just single crochet back loop only all the way around the top of the stocking. So once you have a little bit worked here, you can hold it up and you can see that front loop only just having like that nice defined edge. Continue around just back loop only, single crochet all the way around the top of the stocking. Jumping a little bit ahead here, when you get to the end of this round, you will slip stitch with that first stitch to join, and then chain 1 and turn. So now we will work just a single crochet row around, regular through both loops. We just worked through the back loop only on that first row. Now we're working through both loops like normal. So single crochet around the opening of the stocking, slip stitch to join, chain 1 and turn. Repeat this until you have 5 single crochet rows total completed. So after you've completed the 5 rows, you will slip stitch to join and chain 1 but not turn. You can work more or less here if you want to make the border of your stocking longer or shorter. If you want to add a name or anything, you might want to work a little bit further. So slip stitch to join, chain 1, and then again, do not turn. We're going to once again do a slip stitch row. So we're going to slip stitch through the back loop only around the top, just to give a little bit more structure and thickness to that final edge. This is our very last round for the border of the stocking. So slip stitch back loop only all the way around. You can kind of see how it looks here. It just thickens that edge a little bit and gives kind of like an I-cord look in knitting, if you know what that looks like. Over on the red sample here, you can see that it just has a little bit more structure and a defined edge, and it also makes it more durable so that the top doesn't stretch out. Again, just make sure you're not working these slip stitches too tight, because if you do work them too tight, your stocking might have a little bit of puckering at the top. So when you get to the end, slip stitch with that first stitch to join, cut your yarn and pull through to secure. The very last step is just to add the hanging loop at the top. This makes it just so you can hang it on a hook or a railing or anything to display the stocking. So the hanging loop is just a quick little 3-row piece that we're going to crochet and sew it on the stocking. So begin with a slip knot, leaving a little bit of a tail because this is kind of handy. You can use the tail to sew it onto the stocking. Then you need to chain 25 stitches. Chain loosely. You don't want your chain to be too tight. Just a nice, even, relaxed tension. And then in that second chain from your hook, actually the bar behind that second chain. So if you turn over your chain, you can see there's those little bars that go across the back. We're going to be working into that bar. In the bar behind the second chain from the hook, work a slip stitch. And then work a slip stitch in each stitch across this short row, excuse me. Continue across in the bar behind the chain in each of those stitches. Working into the bar behind the chain just has like a really nice chain look to it. It shows the pretty side of the chain on the exposed edge of your work. So it's kind of a nice technique to use whenever your edge is exposed. When you get to the end, chain 1 and turn. Once again, we will slip stitch back loop only across this row, just as we did with the top border row. We're just working slip stitch back loop only. When you get to the end of this row, you will just chain 1 and turn, and then work a final row slip stitch back loop only across. So it's 3 rows total. Just a short little piece to make the hanging loop. Coming up to that very end, you can see how it's starting to look. Just make sure you get those last couple stitches and then cut your yarn and pull through that final loop to secure. And then you can see here what that back loop only piece looks like. Working the back loop only and just with the slip stitches, we give kind of like a dense piece of crochet fabric that will hold up really nicely for the hanging loop. And you can see here how we fold it. We just turn it over so that the nice smooth right side is showing on both ends. So starting on the edge of, it's the right side of the stocking, so again where the star is on the assembly diagram, kind of by also where the seam is, actually exactly by where the seam is, for our turning chain for the top border as well. We're going to work the hanging loop on either side of that seam. So just place it on the stocking, and it's really easy to sew in. We're basically just going to go over, under, up through that first row. So you can see here, I'm using the tail to attach the hanging loop, and I just went from the back to the front, and now I'm going front to back. Make sure you work into a different hole, of course, each time, but you should essentially just work one stitch of the hanging loop into one row of the border, just as I'm doing here. And if you work between the rows, you can kind of see the V rows that are on the hanging loop. If you work between two of those, it will be really nicely camouflaged. When you get to the very top, you will just carry your yarn across the back of this, the inside of the stocking, and then go back down the other side of the hanging loop. It kind of needs down and back because it's 3 rows thick, so you want to just make sure that it's attached nicely on either end. So again, just as we did on the other side, you just go just a quick stitch down this row. Once you get to the end of that, you will attach the other side of the hanging loop as well. You can use the same tail here if you still have some space left on it, or you could weave in this end and use the other tail that we have hanging there as well. So just as we did on this first side, we will just fold over and attach that other side of the hanging loop with our needle. Just fold it over so that the right side is showing the full way across. Line it up how it looks nice. I think it looks really good if you get it pretty close to that first one and just seam it as we did for the first side. Jumping a little bit ahead here, you can go across the bottom once if the bottom is looking like not super polished or finished. You can do a little stitch duplication technique across the bottom. So what we're going to do is work through those. You can see that each stitch is essentially made up of a V. We're going to go and duplicate across these V stitches. So working our piece, you can see I've attached that first one, and then I'm going in through the back, from the back to the front, and then that V right there, I'm going through the back of that V stitch and then threading my needle through the back of this inside of the stocking again. And then you can kind of see how it just looks like that stitch comes seamlessly from the back to the front. So then from back to front again on the next stitch, around the bottom of that V, and then to the back of the stocking once more. There's just 6 stitches here across the bottom, so you can repeat that in each stitch, and it just really attaches that bottom securely and makes it look super polished and professional. So jumping just a little bit ahead here, I'm finishing up this last little stitch of the hanging loop, and then I just need to weave in all my ends, and we will jump ahead here and I will show you how to felt the stocking. Again, don't be intimidated by felting the stocking. It just makes it a little bit more structured and durable so that it can hold up to a lot of time being hung on your mantle, being stuffed with presents, whatever it takes. So you can see here these stockings are not felted, so they still have really strong stitch definition. They still kind of have holes in them, that the gap spaces between the granny stitch clusters, and it's just a little bit different. Right here you have it after it's felted, and you can see it's a bit thicker. You still have really good stitch definition, but the holes themselves are smaller and kind of more connected and sealed closed a little bit. And then also the toe in the heel is just nicely shaped and lays flat how you want it. So felting these, like I said, it's nothing to be intimidated by. We're just going to do it by hand with a little bit of hot water and some dish soap, and it just gives this structured look, makes it really durable and look nice hanging up on your mantle for many years to come. So it's best to felt them one at a time. I just fill up my sink with hot water, a splash of dish soap, and then you just want to submerge the stocking and gently agitate it, kind of rub it around with your hand. It's a little bit easier, obviously, with 2 hands, but the more you rub it, the more it will felt. You just need a couple minutes, just a gentle felting. And then be sure to just rinse with a cooler water to get out any colors that might have bled because of the hot water. Lay them flat in a nice stocking shape to dry, and then your stocking is completed. I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. Please be sure to comment below with any questions you may have, and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on any new videos and tutorials. Thanks so much. Enjoy!